Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me tell you it's a real pleasure and a great honor for me to introduce our guest this evening. Ambassador Dirigian will moderate a discussion with him, and then he'll open the floor to your questions. Of course, I had the honor of working with our guest during both the Ford and first Bush administrations. And during the latter, I got to know him particularly well. He was National Security Advisor, and I was Secretary of State. We worked together on issues as varied as negotiating the reunification of Germany, kicking Iraq out of Kuwait, and managing Chinese-American relations in the wake of Tiananmen Square. I am particularly proud of our foreign policy accomplishments during the administration of President George H.W. Bush, and that success is due, of course, above all, to the leadership of the President himself. He understood the way the national security apparatus ought to work, and he saw to it that it worked that way. And the reason it worked that way, though, was because we had a superb national security advisor. We had a foreign policy team that worked well together. We sometimes disagreed. All foreign policy teams, all national security teams disagree from time to time, but in general, I think you could say that we were the exception to the rule. You didn't see the kind of backbiting and fighting and squabbling on this foreign policy team that you saw in most every other team, regardless of whether it was a Republican administration or a Democratic administration. And our foreign policy making, I think it's fair to say, was marked by high levels of professional respect and personal trust. And our guest tonight set that tone by his single-minded and his selfless commitment to President Bush. Brent Scowcroft deserves much of the credit for our foreign policy achievements. He is smart, he is unflappable, he's forgotten more about foreign policy than most Americans will ever know, and he's never afraid to articulate an unpopular position. Now, having said all that, I will admit that I'm biased, but I firmly believe that he represents the model. He is the model for everything that a successful national security advisor should be. As time is short, I can only summarize his extraordinary achievements. He's a graduate of West Point. He received a commission in what was then known as the U.S. Army Air Force. He would eventually reach the rank of Lieutenant General, retiring from the Air Force in 1975. A series of ever more senior positions in our foreign policy establishment culminated in his service as National Security Advisor to both Presidents Gerald Ford and George H.W. Bush. More recently, he served as chairman of the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board under President George W. Bush. He is currently president of the Scowcroft Group. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure and a real honor to welcome a great American and a truly good friend, the Honorable Brent Scowcroft.
There's another one here. Okay, you want to sit on the far side? Well, General Scowcroft, with your presence here, Secretary of State Baker's presence here, all we need is President Bush 41, and I'll feel intimidated in the chain of command that we used to work in. But to echo the Secretary, welcome warmly to the Baker Institute. The administration of President George Herbert Walker Bush enjoyed what, in retrospect, seems to have been an extraordinary series of foreign policy successes. The reunification of Germany, the peaceful end of the Cold War, ending with a whimper and not a bang, the assembly of the international coalition that liberated Kuwait in Desert Storm, the ultimate Madrid peace conference that brought Arabs and Israelis together the first time in face-to-face direct negotiations. How much of this success do you consider was due to, one, the overall strategic geopolitical climate that you were working in, and with the President, with the Secretary, and the leadership, your leadership, Secretary Baker's leadership, and President George Herbert Walker Bush's leadership?
You know, I think I won't say anything because it can only go downhill from here after what Jim Baker said about me. I can't improve on that.
All right, well, that was a short answer to a long question.
Well, that's really an excellent question, and I admit to a certain amount of bias myself, but I think we've never had a president better prepared to be president. And we're talking foreign policy than George Bush. He had been in the Congress. He had been chairman of his party. He had been ambassador to the UN, and when he was ambassador to the UN, he used to have a habit of going around to all his fellow ambassadors and say, you know, how are things in your country? What do you think about the United States? What do you think about the UN? You know, fantastic preparation. Then he went to China before we had normal relations with China. And China was like a different world. And so he had to adjust the U.S.-China relationship at a time when it started out as complete hostility and estrangement. Then he came back and he was DCI, Director of Central Intelligence. Then he became vice president. He had done everything here related to foreign policy, and he had absorbed it. So he knew what he wanted to do, and he selected a team, all of whom he had worked with before and whom he figured out could work together rather than separately. And it worked. We used to have, as Jim said, we used to have vigorous and sometimes sharp discussions, just a small group of us around the table. It would get heated sometime, and the president would tell a joke just to bring the tension down. And then he would listen to us all. Then he'd make the decision. And when he made the decision, that was it. There were no kitchen leaks out this way or that way or the other. And I think that tells most of what you need to know. It was thoughtful, careful preparation under somebody who instinctively knew what it was you were talking about. You didn't have to explain the details. And on top of it all, we had a little luck.
Fortuna. Secretary Baker very rightfully characterized you as the epitome of what a national security advisor should be. How would you describe that role, the challenges of being the president's advisor in the White House and the National Security Council, coordinating the views of all the heavyweights, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the Chief of Intelligence? How do you describe that challenge with your experience?
I think the National Security Advisor has 3 jobs. The first is to prepare the paperwork, which starts in the departments, to prepare them in the form that the president wants. The second is to understand and to articulate to the president the views of all of the other members of the Security Council. The honest broker, if you will, fairly and honestly. Because if you don't, the president's time is enormously important. And if you don't, then each cabinet officer will insist on separate time with the president to articulate his views. And the third role is to give your own independent view of what ought to be done. And sometimes those seem to be in conflict. But it's that management that is so important. And having watched as deputy to Henry Kissinger and in the earlier Ford administration, I analyzed what the problems were, and there were frequent problems in the past between the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor competition. Most of that came, I decided, because of not a dispute, but both the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor being the articulator of American foreign policy. And I decided that was wrong. And the Secretary of State was that. So I told Secretary Baker at the outset, I will not go on television, I will not do anything publicly without checking with you first. And we did that for a couple of months, and he called one day and he says, oh, to heck with that, you do it. So that was the kind of relationship we had. And it was a comradely relationship devoted to what are we trying to get out here? What are we trying to get done? Not how do we look better.
Excellent. How would you assess the foreign policy of the Obama administration? How does it differ from its predecessor?
I think the president is a great communicator. When he came into office, he gave a series of foreign policy speeches. And the one in Cairo, for example. I was in the Middle East shortly after he gave that speech, and it was received with great enthusiasm. Here's a president who empathizes with us, who really will get it. But not much happened. And I think there is a gulf between the rhetoric and the actions that I find troubling. I think certain things they have done quite well. The reset with Russia, for example, I think was badly needed. But the follow-up hasn't been perfect again. So I think it's the words are fine, the actions leave something to be desired.
You mentioned Russia. The Republican frontrunner, Mitt Romney, has said that he believes Russia is the United States' #1 geopolitical foe. Do you agree? Does the United States have a #1 geopolitical rival today? If so, who is it? Or are we past that stage?
Well, I guess if you really want to look for one, North Korea is probably a geopolitical foe. They don't believe in anything we believe in. But I don't believe we have one. I don't believe we have geopolitical rivals. We have a complicated relationship with the Russians and a complicated but different kind of complication with the Chinese. But I don't see this as that kind of a world. This is not a world of 1914. It's not a world of 1939. And I think if we mind ourselves and pursue issues with a certain amount of judgment and wisdom, it won't get that way. And so I don't think we ought to look at a world of foes and rivals.
In that perspective, how would you recommend an administration, be it Democratic or Republican, approach China?
Well, we have a complicated relationship with China. First of all, this regime, if you will, began in 1949. It began in a period of great hostility with the United States, and we actually had conflict in the Korean Peninsula with Chinese troops. It was not only communist, it was kind of autarkic, closed in on itself. We had no communication with them other than hostile communication for over 2 decades. Then Nixon reaches out and we establish relations. And then it was sort of easy to do because we both were having big problems with the Soviet Union and joining together to resist Soviet pressures made it very easy. But it at heart is a complicated relationship. because of this estrangement and because we have very different histories, we have very different cultures, we have very different ideas about life and politics and everything. And the Chinese don't empathize with what I would call the Westphalian nation-state system, with a bunch of totally independent states, sovereign equality among them, who are fighting a lot of the time. The Chinese notion is very different historically. It's of the central kingdom. There's China and there's everybody else. Mm-hmm. And China is the natural center of the universe. Now, I'm not saying they practice or believe that now, but that's ingrained in the kind of history. And in addition, the last 200 years of Chinese history is a period of, if you will, rape of China by the Europeans more than the Americans, but impression on China, physically, militarily, for a couple of hundred years. So that's the legacy. Then in 1989 came Tiananmen Square, and we were getting along quite well up until then. And Tiananmen Square not only was a great shock to this system, but it came at the time of the end of the Cold War. So the glue which held it together, which is common action to deal with Soviet aggression, was gone. And we've been rebuilding since. So we have a complicated relationship, and China is naturally getting stronger and more self-confident and more assertive and less autarkic. And there's a natural reaction in the United States to say, right, this is against us. Well, I don't think it is unless we make it so. And the notion that the U.S.-China relationship should be a zero-sum game, I think, is dangerously wrong. I think it need not be. I think maybe we need to be especially mature in the relationship, because I think we can see it more clearly than the Chinese can at this particular time. But I think it's a relationship which, if played right, can improve the quality of both countries and therefore of the world itself. Now, that's a very long
It's a good one. It's a good explanation.
Answer to a short question.
Complex question. The Arab Spring, or the so-called Arab Awakening, has swept much of the Middle East, as you well know, and it's created new challenges, not only for the people of the region, obviously, but for countries outside, and particularly for our country. Challenges and opportunities for the United States. What is your assessment of this phenomenon called the Arab Spring and its impact on our interests in the region? And if you could take it one step further, do you have any thoughts on what a strategic U.S. approach should be to this tectonic shift in the political landscape, especially the Arab world?
Yeah, that's a very comprehensive question.
Right.
I think, first of all, the Arab Spring, I think, is a clear example of the impact of globalization. Mm-hmm. It's a clear impact of the effect of globalization on the nation-state system. And I'll get back to that in a moment. But this is a case where the self-immolation of a poor fruit peddler, manhandled by the police, set off this spark, which went through the Middle East. The Chinese obviously were worried. They took a lot of steps to prevent it. It's a phenomenon, but I think the phenomenon is explainable this way, that for most of world history, the average person was not really involved in issues of state or anything else. You know, people ordinarily in most societies thought they were going to live just the way their fathers lived, and their children would live just the way they lived, and this was the order of life forever. And now, with television, radio, all these things, all of a sudden they look out and they say, hey, it's not so. Mm-hmm. It's not so. And other people are not treated the way we are. Other people have dignity and rights, and we demand those. And I think that is a phenomenon now that is going to spread. We can see evidence of it in Russia now. Mm-hmm. Because globalization, the communications revolution, is politicizing the world's people, and we're going to have to deal with that. Now, the reaction has been different in each country of the Middle East. But, you know, this is probably the fourth generation. You know, you can go back, start with the days of the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire. Mm-hmm. Then came World War I, the collapse of the empires, and the colonial period. Mm-hmm. Then as the colonial period eroded, came the rise of the monarchies and the strongmen. Mm-hmm. And the monarchies are still around, the strongmen are dying off. So this is a new stage in the Middle East. But I think it would be a mistake to say that these uprisings are demand for what we call democracy. Mm-hmm. I think they're a demand for dignity, to be treated like human beings, like people, not like chattel who can be deceived and traded back and forth. And so they have a common goal: get rid of the oppressor. But once that's gone, there is no common ground underneath on which to build what we would call a modern democratic state. And that's the problem, and you see it exquisitely in Egypt at the present time. And one of the problems is that in the days of the dictators, the only political organizations were those who were extremists and worked from underground, like the Muslim Brotherhood, although there are branches of that, they're not all extremists. And so the dictatorship goes, and they have organizations out into the villages and so on. So they're organized to do things. The more democratic groups have not, because they were prevented. And so we're going through an evolution, and it's hard to say where it will end, but it's different in each of the countries, whether you have a relatively homogeneous society like Egypt, but Egypt has 80 million people, right, and the emotion has not spread much beyond Cairo and Alexandria, or to a country like Yemen, which is still heavily tribal and thus reacts in a different way to a very complicated country like Syria, which is Lebanon writ large. It's a melange of different types of Islam, of different ethnic groups, and so on, and makes it very difficult to sort through from the previous strong man into something that we would call representative system.
You mentioned Syria. It's a real conundrum for policymakers. There's a humanitarian crisis in Syria.
Yes.
And you've been in the cockpit of foreign policy formulation in similar circumstances. And the tug between a humanitarian response and the use of force, because many times you cannot enact a humanitarian response unless you clear the ground and establish humanitarian corridors, which mean some military. It's really a perplexing problem for policymakers. I guess the question I have for you is the right to protect doctrine that has recently been, in recent times, has been introduced in the United Nations. How does one really square the circle on humanitarian assistance and the right to protect by military means?
Mm-hmm. That's a really difficult question, which we have not focused sufficiently on. The notion of the right to protect, while it is not a rule of the UN, it is very strongly and has been strongly supported by the Security Council on several times, stemming from the atrocities in Africa earlier, in the Balkans and so on. And the right to protect says if a government cannot or does not protect major elements of its own population, it is the duty of the United Nations to intervene. Well, it sounds good, but the second article of the UN Charter says nothing in this charter gives the right for this organization to interfere in matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of its neighbors. So the two are like this. And it is the right to protect here that is the motivating factor in the Arab Spring. It's what the UN passed on Libya, the right to use force to protect civilians. Well, nobody's figured out exactly how to do this, and the Chinese, of course, think that Article 2 of the UN Charter is the ruling one because they're deathly afraid of intervention into their affairs. Mm-hmm. So we have not come to grips with this. Right. And it gets to be a very, very difficult problem. And it's a very practical problem. If Assad were to depart tomorrow, you would not have a situation like you have in Egypt. Mm-hmm. Now, where the military is unified, it has been moderate, it has had the support of the United States, and so on. You would still have this very fractured society and no obvious successor to take over and run as government. So it's a very, very difficult situation.
The President Bush, 41, Secretary Baker, yourself were instrumental in the landmark Madrid Peace Conference. Again, getting the Arabs and the Israelis to face-to-face negotiations. We made a lot of progress. Mm-hmm. And then there were the 1992 elections and our democratic process, but we did have a change of administration. We lost momentum. President Clinton got very actively engaged in his second mandate, but we did lose the momentum at that time. It's really painful for those who have been involved to see how the peace negotiations have been so stymied, other than the Israeli-Jordanian peace agreement that was done in the aftermath of Madrid, which I think came under the aegis of Madrid. But what's your perception on the current stalemate in negotiations? We're obviously in an election year here in Israel and the Palestinian Authority. But do you think there's a real hope, for example, the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations to resume after our elections here in the United States?
I think there is, and I think if President Bush Sr. had been reelected, I don't know what we have done in a lot of issues. On this issue, I think we would have made progress.
Exactly.
And I think that we're at the point now, our standard position has been to get the parties to sit down and discuss together and come to a conclusion. I don't think they're ever going to be able to do that because of the disparity in strength and a bunch of other things. The outlines of a settlement are obvious to everybody. And at the end of the Clinton administration, the two sides drew up.
Right.
a basic solution to the problem. 67 borders with rectifications, no automatic right of return for refugees, Jerusalem as the capital to both countries, and security arrangements. I think the solution has to come by the United States saying these principles, with some detail on how you get there, is what the United States supports. We would immediately get support from the European Union on things like that. And that's the framework in which you ought to negotiate. And I think we are perilously close to another collapse. And an abandonment of the two-state solution would be a disaster for Israel, but they don't seem to realize that now. Nothing certainly will happen before the election. I don't know whether it will afterward. But that's when I referred to the Cairo speech. That, if you read between the lines, that was all in the Cairo speech, but it was not followed up as a practical matter.
But at the end of the day, it takes a strong American president, be a Democrat or Republican, to put those contours on the table and get the parties to the table.
It does, but you know, if you explain it right, such an arrangement is profoundly in the Israeli interest.
I agree. And
just before he was assassinated, as Jim can attest, Rabin figured that out. Israel's where it is. You can't move Israel. So what do you have to do? You have to make a tolerable situation in which Israel can prosper. And that is the solution, and I think what I've outlined with the support of the United States could provide that solution.
You spent much of your working life serving our country in various capacities. When you look back, we have some young students in the audience here. What advice would you give them about public service and your own experiences?
Well, what I would say, I've retired from so many different things so many times that I've done a lot of things, that I have never found anything more rewarding than working for something bigger than I, bigger than my own personal goals and ambitions. To be feeling, I go home at night and say, I actually did something for my country. It's a feeling that is hard to replicate in any other way. And talking to the young people this afternoon, I think that that is something that they all should aspire to. And one of the things I most regret about the dialogue, our national dialogue today, is everybody is campaigning against Washington. Mm-hmm. And our government is only as good as the people who serve in it. And we ought to try to get the best people in the country to want to do that. Because as I say, I find it personally very rewarding as well.
Couldn't agree more. General Scowcroft spent an hour with Rice students this afternoon in a wonderful exchange, which was a great experience for our students, and thank you for doing that. I'm now going to open the floor for your questions. So if you would go to the microphone, please. I see Charles Foster. And please go to the microphones. And then if you would identify yourselves and then ask your question. Please, no speeches, but we do tolerate elaborated questions.
General Scowcroft, Charles Foster. One of the big issues being discussed is, of course, Iran, what to do, and I don't have to tell anyone here about all those issues. What is your opinion? What should the U.S. be doing on that now?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me start by saying the number of times that the imposition of sanctions to change political behavior has actually worked, you can count on the fingers of one hand. It's not has not been practiced, been a great solution to the problem. I think we are not in a bad position now, though, because the sanctions are applying pressure. They are making things more difficult. But I think we ought not to leave it either surrender to the sanctions or go to war. We need to have a negotiating option. And the negotiating option for me, which President Obama sort of outlined in the campaign, in fact, he got criticized for it, for appeasing, be willing to discuss with Iran. The outline is, look, we are not after regime change. We're not trying to destroy you. We understand you have security problems. We're prepared to sit down with you and figure out a regional security structure in which you will feel you have some security. This is not the way to go to get security. Indeed, you will end up, if you pursue it, less secure than you are now. I don't know if it would work, but I think we need that strong element in it. I have to say, it's very hard to negotiate with Iran because you don't know who to negotiate with. They have a government with a foreign minister and all that, but has very little actual power. You have the mullahs who have the fundamental political power in the country and can overrule the government. And then you have the Revolutionary Guard, which not only keeps the military down, but also they're the enforcers of the mullahs. Now, who do you talk to? And in the past, as Jim knows, they've been reluctant to talk to us, any of them, because they're afraid of being accused of conniving with the great Satan. So it's an extremely difficult problem. But I don't think we should give up. You know, we have a tendency in this country when we have very difficult political problems and so on, I say, let's just cut through it. Let's use the military and get this thing over with. It doesn't work that way. Because when you use the military, you change the fundamental situation which you began with. So by the time you finish, you no longer have the same problem you started with. And you can't always tell what that problem is going to be, which we've seen in Iraq, which we've seen in Afghanistan. So we need patience and wisdom. And it may not work. But I think force in this case would be regrettable for the United States.
Thank you. Gentlemen, if you identify yourself.
General, thank you for your great service to our country.
Thank you.
With China, one thing that I'm concerned about is the over $300 billion of debt that we have to China. Would you talk about how that might be handled and what effect it has on the relationship between our two countries?
Actually, I think it has a very stabilizing influence on our two countries, because you know, if you owe the bank $50 or so, they're in the driver's seat. If you owe them most of the net worth of the bank, you're in the driver's seat. And that's sort of where we are. They're our second largest debt holder, a huge amount of money. But first of all, they don't have any place. If they had some place safer to put it, they might do it. They don't. And secondly, they're then a hostage because the money's in our control. So yeah, I actually don't think it's a factor of instability. I think it's a factor of stability. What it demonstrates, though, is the basic dilemma of the Chinese, because the Chinese prosperity has been driven significantly by exporting cheap goods to the United States and to Europe. And it's worked very well. That market, because of the financial situation, is drying up rapidly. China needs to develop a domestic consumption market, but you don't do that overnight. That's a hard sell, especially to the Chinese, who are notoriously frugal. And so that's the dilemma that we all have in working this out.
My name is Max Ingram Rakitansky. I'm a student at Rice University. Jim Baker said that you had one of the most compact organizations, that you all agreed there wasn't as much dissent as before, and you yourself said that the president time is very valuable. And so in solidarity versus dissent, and you have places where the State Department was solidarity in, for instance, the 1953 coup in Iran and the Vietnam, you have people who disagreed, they weren't heard. And so how do you value the solidarity of making decisions versus the ability to critique and have dissent for the direction that the State Department's going?
Well, I think you can have both. I don't think that you have to do one or the other. You can have vigorous debates, and we didn't agree on everything. And I think, of the Gang of Eight or something, the group that sat around informally and discussed these things, there was a range from right to left on attitudes, but there was an understanding that the president was a decision maker, and he was our president, and we give him the best thoughts we've had, and he listened to them all and asked some questions, and then he says, I think we do this. That's a decision, and we all supported, and nobody went out and background to the press that he was stymied or didn't get a chance to make his argument. Everybody made their arguments. But the arguments ended when the president said that this is the way I want to do it. And that, to me, that is the ideal way to do it. And that's what President Bush did so beautifully, over and over and over again.
Great.
I'm Ron Young. General Scowcroft, there's something that has been on my mind, and that is there has to be some perception of pushback against one aspect of our foreign policy, and that is that people all over the world are not necessarily taking to the streets and risking their lives for any notion of American democracy, Jeffersonian democracy. And yet that continues to be the salient point, and at least what's offered to the public in our foreign policy. Do you think we should back off of that and maybe make the driving wedge of our policy something in whatever, healthcare, education, market policy, something that America has a definite achievement with, it may be more marketable in the East or in the Middle East than some vague notion of our concept of democracy?
Well, that's the old argument between realism and idealism. And the realist says, we deal with foreign countries the way they are. And the idealist says, everybody wants to be like the United States, we should help them. And in our 200-odd years, we've gone a long way. The first 100 or 150 were solely realistic. We didn't help anybody. We said, we're the shining city on the hill, and we hope people will emulate us. But whether they do or not is up to them, not us. And then came Woodrow Wilson, and changed it and said, we need to proselytize. Now, what the extent is of that is up to the American people. And there, we had a debate, for example, on Libya. Was Libya our idealism, or was it our interests? Our overwhelming interests are in Syria in terms of changing the neighborhood, but it was easier to do in Libya. So these are very complicated questions. But I I hope it's not an either or between our foreign policy, whatever the goals end up, and our domestic policy. And don't get me on education, because I think we are in dreadful shape. The statistics show we're in dreadful state in kindergarten through 12th grade in education. We're falling farther and farther and farther behind. So I don't think it's either or on that one.
Thank you.
Chase Untermeyer.
Yes, General Scowcroft, I'm Chase Untermeyer. You mentioned the three roles that you see of a national security advisor: to be the collector, analyst of different opinion, to be the faithful reporter of that opinion to the president, and then to ultimately give advice. Do you think in that is a proper role for the national security advisor to be a strong advocate of a particular position taken by one of the departments, to in effect be in the fight?
Well, I think that's part 3. And if I were talking to the president, just the two of us, I would say, Jim Baker, I represent, thinks this, Dick Cheney thinks this, Vice President thinks this, and these are the arguments pro and con. And now, having said that, here's what I think. And I think that is a responsible way to provide a complete and accurate picture to the president. Now, did I always get it right? I'm not sure I did, but I did my best, and that is of the most value to the president. Now, why the National Security Advisor's opinion? In the abstract, let's take personalities out of it. The Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State are not only the advisors to the president, they're the heads of big departments who have their own interests, ethics, the way of doing things. And they have to also represent those departments to the White House. The National Security Advisor has no formal outside such organization. So his advice is not modified, tempered, or anything anyway by the demands of the institution he represents.
Good. Sir.
Carter Kittrell from the Smalley Institute of Nanotechnology. In about 1979, when we had an oil crisis and a shortage, the president of the American Metal Society said, if they cut off our chromium, it would be far worse because we have absolutely no source at all. And there's a lot of the periodic table that's really not in the United States. So cobalt, manganese, indium, gallium, lithium, and so on. Now, Afghanistan has been described as a Saudi Arabia of minerals, of mineral wealth. So I'm just wondering if, one thing is that if we could somehow bring all that to market, that would be very good for the world. On the other hand, if we leave and it's captured by regional interests, I'm just wondering, is there a concern that 2-3 decades down the road that strategic minerals, will be controlled by a few people and could be extremely damaging to the United States if we did not have access to these?
Well, that gets to Afghanistan, which is quite a problem in and of itself. I think we're discovering Afghanistan is mineral rich in many respects. It always has been, and they've never been exploited. That's the first point. But it gets to where we are in Afghanistan and where we ought to be in Afghanistan. And I think that's a very complicated story. After 9/11 occurred, I think it's reasonable. The United States had to do something. We couldn't just say, there's a bunch of thugs and we're not going to respond. And the first response was Afghanistan. And it was a moderate and very successful response. we allied ourselves with the troops of the Northern Alliance and provided intelligence, some drones, some fire support, and so on, and they moved down and kicked out the Taliban. Then we changed our focus to Iraq, and things started to fall apart in Afghanistan. So we went back in to try to stabilize it and ask our NATO friends to come in with us. Then President Obama, running for election, criticized our presence in Iraq. We ought to get out of Iraq. That's a mistake. Where we really need to be is Afghanistan. My sense is he hadn't really thought through Afghanistan. But he didn't want to look weak by saying we ought to get out of Iraq. So Afghanistan's where we ought to be. We've had several different strategies in Afghanistan. I think we don't need an Afghanistan which is a modern nation state. What we need is an Afghanistan that is not a cesspool for extremism. And that also, I think, is the interest of most or all of the countries surrounding Afghanistan. And one of the things I think that we're doing, which is, I hope will have some success, is to talk to Afghanistan's neighbors and see if we can't get some kind of understanding there. We are fatigued. We are leaving Afghanistan, I think, probably too rapidly and jeopardizing some of the gains we've made now by leaving prematurely. But that's my judgment. I think it's probably the majority military judgment in the administration. But I hope we will not simply abandon Afghanistan, but we'll work with the Chinese, the Russians, the Pakistanis, and indeed the Iranians, because they all have the same interest we have, and that is not an Afghanistan which is a threat to them on their borders.
Thank you. Good.
My name is Fadi Yacoub. I was born in Damascus, Syria, and I totally agree with you. It's a very complex country and a very complex situation, and I want to ask what your opinion on the way the current administration is handling the situation, and if you were to advise the president, what would your advice be on arming or not arming the opposition? Thank you.
I think arming the opposition might be the way to go, but what it would certainly do is ensure that you have a full-scale civil war. So far, the military, which is Alawite and indeed Assad-led in many respects, is a melange, and the common troops, the majority of them are Sunni, not Shia. They have been fundamentally loyal up to this point. Some desertions, but not too heavily. The business community is coming under severe economic pressure because of the sanctions and the isolation of Syria, but it hasn't deserted as well. It seems to me that providing troops or providing ammunition and arms to the rebels without engaging ourselves is not a prudent course of action. It might work, it might not, but it certainly would increase the casualties to a remarkable extent. So, there's the option of using force ourselves, and that's not going to happen. So I think just because there's a terrible problem doesn't mean there's a good solution. And this is a case where there aren't any apt solutions that come to my mind. And I think that indeed, perhaps the best thing that we can do is what Kofi Annan just hopefully succeeded in doing, and that is to get Assad to back off the places where violence is not heavy. If the violence can stop, if the opposition is strong enough, eventually the system will fall. But I don't think we ought to aid and abet the bloodshed to an extensive degree like arming the rebels would do.
These would be the last two questions on this side.
Yes, Alan Livingston. General, you've already talked in depth about Afghanistan and Iraq. My question involves the military. We've had 10 years or a decade of conflict. We've seen a lot of different changes in military ideas and policies. As a retired general, what changes do you suggest that we make in our military to better cope with foreign policy decisions we will have to implement in the future?
Well, I think, first of all, we're pretty well prepared now. The problem is not the tactics so much, although if you can figure out an answer to IED, that's the remotely detonated explosives, that would be a real service to us. The problem is the political goals and how you achieve them, or can you achieve them? Because we've gone from anti-terrorist strategy to a counterinsurgency strategy, back to an anti-terrorist strategy, and they're very different strategies. And in the counterterrorism strategy, you find a bad guy and you take him out. And if you kill some civilians along with it, that's too bad, but it's collateral damage. If you're doing nation building and you find the same bad guy and he's in a bunch of civilians, you don't take him out because you do more harm to your goals by killing the civilians than you do by taking out the bad guy. And we've gone back and forth on that in Afghanistan. So I think in terms of what we need to do to our armed forces now, we're turning to an emphasis on, apparently a budget emphasis on Navy and Air Force, because we don't think we're going to be doing these things anymore. I think that's probably a mistake. We did it once before in Vietnam, and the military after Vietnam said, well, we're never going to do this again, so they tore up all the textbooks, except for General Petraeus. And we had to learn them over again in Iraq. So I think, as I indicated, this is a problem-filled world now, and we're entering a period where we're going to have a lot more fractious issues to deal with people who are stimulated by what they read and what they hear and want to take action to better their situations. So, do we want to use force? No, we don't. Is there a responsibility to protect? Yes, of some kind. And that's what we need to keep our eye on in a world which I think we're going to see more Arab Springs.
Okay, last question to a Rice student.
My name is Nadik Ramachandran. I am a Rice student, and thank you very much for coming. So you spoke about how the Arab Spring is a search for dignity and how there's growing international support for encouraging human rights with the right to protect. However, the United States has a lot of allies like Saudi Arabia who don't have a great record on human rights. Do you think that our support for countries like Saudi Arabia is going to hurt us in the future, and that there's any way we should change our policies right now towards these countries to avoid future harm?
Well, I think, that gets back to the realism, idealism argument again. And I think that change will be coming to a lot of countries, including perhaps the United States. So I think we need to be prudent, and we need to try to help the countries that we're close to make the right decision, and not simply push them to a democratic election or throw out the leaders if there's no preparation for anything but chaos afterwards. Nor to say, gee, you're in control now, just stay there, if we think that some modifications would help relieve the pressure and move toward a basic element. That is an art form, and that's why a good NSC system, the president, the vice president, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, CIA, and the National Security Advisor, that's what they spend hours trying to figure out. What's the best way to sort through conflicting goals? Very hard.
Thank you.
General Scowcroft, thank you for sharing your wisdom and your insights with us. Join me in thanking General Scowcroft.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Terrific. Thank you.